You're back with The Nation, and welcome to our next guests, who were all players in the ANZUS crisis that led to a key turning point in New Zealand's foreign policy. With us is Margaret Pope, David Lange's widow and speechwriter, Russell Martin, who took over Lange's foreign affairs portfolio, and in Dunedin, peace activist, Russell Marshall, and in Dunedin, peace activist and academic Professor Kevin Clements. Thank you all for joining us this morning. Russell, if I can start with you. Is this a picture that we've heard this morning from Gerald Hensley, the picture that he's painted, that David Lange was a bit sceptical, a bit ambiguous about the anti-nuclear policy? Is that an accurate picture?
I think it is, Rachel. I think that initially David was keen to find some accommodation with the Americans, and he was keen for ships to come in if something could be worked out. But he was also mindful of the fact that the party had a different view, and as time went on, in one way he was negotiating and working out a way whereby that could happen, and on the other hand trying to see off the party. And sometimes people got confused about what he really thought. He was probably confused himself. I think we were all a bit confused. We wanted to have our cake and eat it too.
Margaret Pope, you perhaps know better than anyone what was maybe going on in his mind through all of this. Did he want to find a way to allow ships to visit?
Oh yes, that was Labour's policy, that New Zealand would be nuclear free and stay in ANZUS. I mean, it sounds laughable now, but it was well intentioned, and that was his goal.
Kevin, were there any circumstances with which the peace movement would have been prepared to allow a US Navy vessel to visit this country?
It would have had to have been a completely unequivocal nuclear-free ship and a nuclear-incapable ship, and no nuclear-powered and no capacity for any nuclear weapons on it. So in Gerald's book, he sometimes talks about it as a rust bucket, but an Oliver Perry Hazard-type frigate would have been acceptable, something that was completely incapable of carrying any nuclear weapons, and certainly not nuclear-propelled. And that wasn't the case with the Buchanan.
And would that have ever have been possible under the Americans' neither confirm nor deny policy?
Well, I think the Americans were hoping that we would go the Norwegian or the Danish way, and we would sort of fudge with the don't ask, don't tell policy. But the peace movement certainly wasn't prepared to do that. We wanted to make sure that any American ship that came to New Zealand ports was unequivocally conventionally powered and incapable of carrying nuclear weapons or discharging any nuclear weapons.
So there was no way, as far as the peace movement was concerned, really, that a ship could come in?
The peace movement was pretty unequivocal.
Russell, as we've heard in Gerald Hensley's book here, that David Lange, he says, was telling the Americans one thing, the public something else. Were there members of the cabinet who believed that Lange was misleading them?
No, we didn't know much about it, Rachel. What tended to happen was that if David thought he wasn't going to get something through easily, if there was going to be an argument, a paper would be prepared for him, but it never went to Cabinet. I mean, for example, the same thing happened with the frigates. I was astonished to find how much had been agreed to without the Cabinet being advised. So he was sometimes cautious about letting us know what was going on because he was a bit afraid that we might try and alter it. I think that was what was going on in his head. So we were not privy to what his thinking was. Even Jeffrey wasn't privy to it.
And Margaret, some say that David Lange was very afraid of, or wary of, confrontation too. Was that in his personality?
He wouldn't have been a member of Parliament. He wouldn't have been Prime Minister. He was actually afraid of an argument.
But wary or keen to avoid confrontation, not comfortable with confrontation?
No, he didn't like disappointing people. He didn't like letting people down. But he was always up for a fight. Was
he, Russell?
No. He would, sadly, Margaret, there were two occasions I can remember where he just, when somebody said no to him, for example, on the composition of the Royal Commission, he brought a proposal to Cabinet. Roger Douglas said no, and he wouldn't talk about it any further. The same thing happened about the Hawaiian loans affair. The moment Richard Prebble said no, that was the end of it. He wouldn't have a conversation. He couldn't converse. He couldn't exchange and negotiate. And I think that was why, although he had papers from Foreign Affairs, he was probably apprehensive about what would happen if he went to Cabinet. And Foreign Affairs thought that he would say one thing to them, and genuinely, I think, but then he'd go out and appeal to the public, so that people did get a bit confused about that. And Cabinet was sometimes confused too.
Is that why perhaps we read in this book and we hear that he was maybe telling the Americans one thing and the public and the party another.
Yeah, but that sounds dishonest. But in a way, I don't think David would have seen himself as being dishonest. He was hoping to find some way in which those two things could come together. And I just think, given what Kevin said about what was acceptable, I just think it was impossible. They were irreconcilable views. You couldn't bring them together, even though everybody's tried very hard, including the British and the Americans.
So the suggestions that he was playing a double game, if he was, you don't think there was...
No, I suspect that he genuinely thought he could get something resolved, and he wanted to get something resolved.
Kevin Clements, did you have confidence? Sorry, carry on.
Well, you shouldn't underestimate the power of Foreign Affairs and the Department of Defence at that stage. Their primary ambition, and Gerald Hensley's primary ambition, was to ensure that New Zealand remained at ANZUS, and they were very prepared and were always prepared to abandon the anti-nuclear policy. They considered it a folly in terms of, as Frank Corner put it, the 40 years spent cultivating the ANZUS alliance. And so the notion that that alliance was going to be somehow or other jeopardized by an anti-nuclear policy, sent shockwaves through the defence and foreign affairs establishment. So David would have been under enormous pressure from all of his advisors to try and seek an accommodation, which is why he dispatched you and Jamison to seek Crow and everything else. And the peace movement, on the other hand, was extraordinarily worried about a kind of a double deal being done, and that's why we were so sensitive to what was happening in Cabinet at that stage.
Margaret, do you think that David Lange at this point may have felt that some of his officials were opposed to him? People like Gerald Hensley, were they opposed to his positioning, do you think?
Gerald and the officials wanted what was sometimes called the Danish solution. That's where the government of the host country says we're not having nuclear weapons here, but in fact the Americans sent them. Or even in Japan, where the Japanese constitution made it non-nuclear, but the Americans used to send from time to time nuclear weapons there. Now that is a fundamentally dishonest policy. And David asked them to find a solution to the problem which allowed us to be nuclear free and stay in ANZUS. Now I've got no way of knowing what he said to his officials, but the public record quite clearly shows that every time he was asked about it by any journalist, he would say, we're not going to have nuclear weapons here, or as he used to put it, we're not going to be holding the handle of the nuclear umbrella. And when that was said, I don't know what Gerald and his colleagues thought that he meant, but it seems from Gerald's book that they thought, well, the Prime Minister can lie to the public, he can lie to his party, but he can't lie to his public servants.
I want to read a quote from Hensley's book. It was after the Oxford Union debate. And you said to Bruce Brown from MFAT, time to get out of ANZUS, Bruce. I
didn't. I meant every word. Before I went to Oxford, I was really quite indifferent about ANZUS. I thought, well, it's our policy to be in it, and if we can be in it, that's good. But once I realised how duplicitous the alliance was, how willing its proponents were to base it on a lie that we would be nuclear free, and in fact we weren't, I thought, well, what is the point? The Americans wouldn't have it unless it was based on their policy of nuclear deterrence, and Russell had no time for that, David had no time for that, nobody had any time for that.
When did he come round to that position?
David?
Yes.
Oh, David, from a young age, thought that nuclear deterrence was a form of collective madness. But unlike some in his party, he wasn't against ANZUS. He wasn't anti-American. He hated the sin but loved the sinner.
But he was prepared to let ANZUS go, though?
In the end, that's what the Americans decided, that you couldn't be nuclear free and stay in ANZUS. That wasn't David's choice.
Russell.
And that was the problem we faced on the Defence Committee of Inquiry, because if you tried to square the circle, as it were, it became clear that it was just impossible. There was no mood in Washington to allow a kind of a genuinely nuclear-free ally That was America's huge mistake in terms of alliance management. If it had agreed to a different solution, one which would have allowed the New Zealand government to make its own decisions on NCND and so forth, then it might have been possible. But they weren't prepared to do that, so it was an impossibility. And so therefore we had to, in a sense, be stood down from ANZUS, and that's what resulted in the eventual collapse of ANZUS. But all of the predictions that were made by Frank Corner and the foreign policy establishment and so forth never came to pass. I mean, it's certainly true that we lost out on intelligence and we weren't able to joint exercise and so forth. But in terms of loss of influence, loss of trade, and so forth, I don't think you can. The arguments that Gerald makes are acceptable.
Russell, if it had come down to a choice between allowing ships into ports or leaving ANZUS, what do you think would have been the Cabinet's position?
Well, opinions vary. I thought that if we'd worked at it properly and sensitively, and if David had been able to talk with people, I suspect, although I would have voted against it, that the Buchanan would have got in. But I became later on aware as Foreign Minister, this is a much bigger picture than just New Zealand and Australia and the United States. I mean, the Spaniards were watching all this very carefully. The Danish ticked me off when I got there for making things more difficult for them.
The Russians were quite happy about it.
Yes, indeed, which didn't help us particularly. In the end, fortuitously as it happened, the Cold War was about to end. And all of this became slightly irrelevant. Gorbachev and Reagan reached an agreement, even though Reagan didn't seem to know what it was about, I suspect. And the Cold War, to all intents and purposes, finishes 2 or 3 years after all of this. And life went on. But I think it's not fair to assume that all of the foreign affairs people were going to be tough and being always pro-American and so on. That's not true. And if you look through the papers, you'll find people like Merv Norris and others trying very hard to find some solution and help the Prime Minister in what he was trying to do. And there was a lot of attempts, genuine attempts, made by the British in particular, and to some extent even the Americans, to try and bring it all together.
Margaret, do you think David Lange had any regrets at all about the way he handled the ANZUS crisis?
None at all. He said himself that the Oxford speech was the high point of his political career.
All right. Margaret Pope, appreciate your time this morning. Also, Russell Marshall, yours as well, and Kevin Clements, thank you too for joining us from Dunedin.